The immovable anchor. What if the greatest source of financial stability in human history was also its most brutal straitjacket? We worship gold for its permanence, its incorruptible purity, its promise of value that endures beyond kings and empires. For centuries, the global monetary system was built upon this simple, brutal logic. Paper money was merely a promise, a claim ticket, redeemable for a fixed, immovable weight of this sacred metal. It was the golden anchor, holding the turbulent seas of commerce and state ambition in check. But herein lies the paradox, the profound cognitive dissonance. This very anchor of stability, this guarantor of trust, became the primary obstacle to human progress, ambition, and survival in the modern age. The 20th century didn't just abandon the gold standard, it executed it in a secret, coordinated coup. This is the story of that execution. The classical gold standard, perfected in the late 19th century, was a marvel of automatic regulation. It was a system of monetary policy without central bankers, a global financial system governed by physics. A country's money supply was directly tied to its gold reserves. Run a trade deficit? Gold would physically flow out to your trading partners, reducing your monetary base, causing prices to fall, making your exports cheaper, and automatically correcting the imbalance. It was harsh, impersonal, and brutally effective. Economic stability was maintained through periodic recessions and deflation that squeezed debtors and workers, a sacrifice on the altar of price stability and fixed exchange rates. The world operated on a rhythm of boom, gold outflow, contraction, and recalibration, a cycle as predictable as the tides. This system created an unprecedented era of global capital flows and international trade. Investors could send money across the Atlantic with near-perfect confidence in its value upon arrival. It was the first true age of financial globalization. But the gold standard's rigidity was its fatal flaw. It demanded that the internal domestic economy, employment, industrial growth, social welfare, be wholly subservient to the external goal of maintaining gold convertibility. When war or crisis struck, the system had no give, no flexibility. It offered stability, but at the cost of sovereignty. Nations could not print money to fight a war or cushion a depression without breaking their golden pledge. The anchor held the ship steady, but it also prevented it from maneuvering to avoid the iceberg. The first major crack appeared with the cataclysm of World War I. The costs of total war were astronomical, far exceeding any nation's gold reserves. To finance the conflict, governments across Europe suspended convertibility. They severed the link between their paper currencies and gold, printing money freely to pay for soldiers and shells. This was the first great act of betrayal against the old system. The post-war attempt to return to the gold standard in the 1920s was a desperate, ghostly pantomime of the pre-war order. The exchange rates were set at pre-war parities, ignoring the massive inflation and debt that now saturated the global economy. The anchor was thrown back overboard, but the ship was now a battered, listing wreck, and the chain was too short for the deeper, darker waters. The Great Depression of the 1930s was the gold standard's fatal trial. As banks failed and demand collapsed, the system's automatic mechanisms kicked in with savage force. To stem gold outflows, central banks raised interest rates, crushing struggling businesses and deepening the economic collapse. Countries engaged in beggar-thy-neighbor policies, devaluing their currencies and erecting trade barriers in a doomed attempt to hoard what little gold remained. The gold standard, designed to create stability, instead amplified the disaster into a synchronized global depression. It became clear that preserving the system meant sacrificing the real economy, the jobs, the farms, the factories, on its golden altar. The political will to make that sacrifice was evaporating. The execution was now not a matter of if, but when and by whom. The first betrayal. What does a president do when the very rules of economic stability are guaranteeing mass ruin? In 1933, with a quarter of the American workforce jobless and banks shuttering daily, Franklin Delano Roosevelt faced this paradox head-on. The orthodox solution, demanded by the gold standard, was more austerity, tighter money, balanced budgets, and patience for the automatic correction. But Roosevelt chose a path of radical, deliberate heresy. His New Deal was more than a package of public works. It was a direct assault on the financial orthodoxy that had failed the nation. The first, and most symbolic, blow was the executive order that made the private hoarding of gold coins, bullion, and certificates illegal for American citizens. The state was forcibly recalling the sacred metal. This was more than a confiscation. It was a psychological severing. For generations, gold had been the ultimate store of value, the asset one turned to when paper promises failed. By outlawing private ownership, Roosevelt was nationalizing trust itself. He was saying that the government's promise, the full faith and credit of the United States, would now be the bedrock, not a physical commodity. The seized gold was revalued overnight by government fiat, from $20.67 to $35 an ounce. This devaluation of the dollar was a deliberate act of financial warfare against deflation. It instantly boosted the nominal value of the U.S. gold reserves, creating the illusion of greater capacity to back the currency, while simultaneously making American goods cheaper on world markets. It was a masterstroke of political economy, putting domestic economic recovery above international monetary rules. The international reaction was one of shock and fragmentation. The global financial system, already on life support, was now officially fractured. Countries were forced into currency blocks, the sterling area, the dollar block, anchored to a leading power's currency rather than to gold directly. International trade became a maze of tariffs, exchange controls, and competitive devaluations. The grand, automatic equilibrium of the classical gold standard was replaced by managed, often hostile, economic nationalism. The world learned it could, in fact, survive without the golden anchor. The recovery that followed, though slow and uneven, was powered by government spending and managed currencies, not by a return to metallic discipline. The lesson of the Great Depression was seared into the minds of a generation of economists and policymakers. Rigid adherence to gold could be fatal. Yet, the ghost of gold was not fully exorcised. As World War II raged, planners in the US and UK, particularly John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White, began designing the post-war international monetary system. There was a consensus. A return to the chaotic, predatory pre-war system was unthinkable, but a pure fiat currency system, backed by nothing but government decree, seemed too radical, too prone to inflationary abuse. The solution was a bizarre, fragile hybrid, the Bretton Woods system. It was a gold standard in disguise, a gilded cage with a single, dominant warden. The world was about to witness the last, and most peculiar, incarnation of the golden anchor. The gilded cage of Bretton Woods. Could you rebuild the gold standard, but with an escape hatch? That was the impossible puzzle facing the architects of Bretton Woods in 1944. The system they designed was a masterpiece of compromise, an intricate financial machine meant to reconcile the desire for stability with the need for flexibility. Under this new order, the US dollar was anointed as the world's reserve currency. It alone would be directly convertible to gold at the fixed rate of $35 per ounce. All other major currencies would peg their value to the dollar, not to gold itself. This created a de facto gold exchange standard, a hierarchical system with America as the sole guarantor, sitting atop the global pyramid of credit. The Bretton Woods institutions, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, were created as the system's guardians and surgeons. The IMF would provide short-term loans to countries facing balance of payments crises, allowing them to defend their currency pegs without resorting to the brutal deflation of the old gold standard. It was the promised escape hatch. The World Bank would finance long-term reconstruction and development, aiming to create the economic stability that would prevent crises in the first place. This new architecture promised the best of both worlds, the discipline of fixed exchange rates to foster trade, and the flexibility of international credit to cushion national economies. For a time, it seemed to work miraculously, underpinning the post-war economic boom. But a fatal flaw was engineered into the system from its very inception, a ticking time bomb known as the Triffin dilemma. Named after economist Robert Triffin, it pointed out an irresolvable contradiction. To fuel global economic growth and provide liquidity for international trade, the United States had to run persistent balance of payments deficits, pumping dollars out into the world. But as those dollar liabilities held by foreign governments and central banks grew and grew, they would inevitably come to exceed the value of the U.S. gold reserves sitting in Fort Knox. The promise of dollar-to-gold convertibility would become mathematically impossible to keep. The system required the U.S. to be permanently in debt to the world to function, yet that very debt would ultimately destroy confidence in its foundational promise. Bretton Woods was built on a paradox that guaranteed its own collapse. For 2 decades, the contradiction was papered over by America's overwhelming post-war economic and political dominance. The dollar was as good as gold because America was the arsenal of democracy and the engine of the free world. European and Japanese central banks were content to hold dollars, which earned interest, rather than demand physical gold, which did not. But as the 1960s progressed, the pressures mounted. America's domestic spending on the Great Society and, crucially, the Vietnam War led to massive deficits and inflation. The flood of dollars abroad swelled into a torrent. The once unthinkable prospect of a run on the U.S. gold stock became a palpable fear in the corridors of power. The golden anchor was still there, but the chain was now made of faith in American policy, and that faith was fraying fast. The run on Fort Knox. What happens when the world's bank faces a silent, slow-motion bank run? The 1960s witnessed this unprecedented scenario. As dollars accumulated in foreign central banks, particularly in France under the nationalist guidance of President Charles de Gaulle, a quiet rebellion began. De Gaulle, advised by the economist Jacques Rueff, saw the Bretton Woods system for what it was, an exorbitant privilege that allowed America to finance its deficits and project its power by exporting its inflation to the rest of the world. In 1965, France began a deliberate policy of converting its dollar holdings into gold, sending warships to New York to physically retrieve the metal. This was not just an economic transaction. It was a political and symbolic assault on American financial hegemony. The U.S. responded with a series of desperate, stopgap measures to protect its dwindling gold reserves. It strong-armed allies into agreements not to convert their dollars. It created a two-tier gold market, where the official $35 price was maintained for central bank transactions, while a separate, free market was allowed to fluctuate. It issued gold certificates and invented special drawing rights at the IMF, essentially synthetic gold, in a futile attempt to create new reserve assets. These were the financial equivalent of applying bandages to a hemorrhaging artery. Every measure was an admission that the core promise of Bretton Woods was untenable. The system was being sustained not by sound economics, but by political pressure and financial engineering. The pressure reached a critical point. By the early 1970s, the United States, the supposed guarantor of global monetary stability, was itself suffering from stagflation, a toxic combination of stagnant growth and rising inflation. The need to defend the overvalued dollar at $35 an ounce forced the Federal Reserve into a monetary straitjacket, preventing it from raising interest rates to fight domestic inflation for fear of attracting even more destabilizing capital flows. The external constraint of gold was once again directly conflicting with domestic economic needs, just as it had in the 1930s. America faced a stark choice: sacrifice its domestic economy on the altar of an international promise it could no longer keep, or break that promise unilaterally. The stage was set for the final act. The dam finally broke in the summer of 1971. Speculative attacks against the dollar intensified, with billions flooding into stronger currencies like the German mark and Japanese yen. Gold was hemorrhaging from U.S. reserves at an alarming rate. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon addressed the nation in a secret Sunday evening broadcast. He announced a sweeping new economic policy, which included wage and price controls. But the centerpiece, delivered with calm finality, was the temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. The Nixon shock was, in reality, the single bullet to the head of the international gold standard. The anchor chain was cut. The world's currencies were set adrift. The execution was complete. The floating world. What replaces a murdered system? In the immediate aftermath of the Nixon shock, the world entered a period of monetary chaos and frantic negotiation. Leaders hoped to stitch together a new set of fixed exchange rates, perhaps with devalued currencies and a higher gold price. Meetings at the Smithsonian Institution produced a short-lived agreement, the Smithsonian Agreement, which devalued the dollar and attempted to maintain fixed parities. But it was a ghost, a system without a soul. Without the golden anchor, there was no credible discipline. Speculators knew central banks lacked the will or the reserves to defend arbitrary lines in the sand. By 1973, the last attempts at fixing had collapsed. The world had stumbled, by accident rather than design, into a new era, the era of floating exchange rates. This was a fundamental revolution in the concept of money. Currency values were no longer dictated by a physical commodity or a grand international treaty. They were now set by the hourly verdict of the foreign exchange market, a vast, electronic arena where perceptions of inflation, growth, political stability, and sheer speculative sentiment battled for supremacy. Central banks, once guardians of a fixed peg, were now supposed to be managers of this chaos, using interest rates and occasional interventions to lean against the wind. The new mantra was monetary sovereignty. Each nation could now, in theory, set its own independent monetary policy to suit its domestic needs, free from the constraint of defending a gold parity. But this newfound freedom came with a terrifying counterpart: volatility. The 1970s became the decade of the Great Inflation. Unleashed from the discipline of gold and grappling with the oil price shocks of 1973 and 1979, governments and central banks succumbed to the temptation of printing money. The belief was that they could spend their way to growth and manage the trade-offs between inflation and unemployment. The result was a corrosive, worldwide rise in prices that eroded savings, sparked social unrest, and created a crisis of confidence in paper money itself. Gold, the executed monarch, staged a ghostly comeback, its market price soaring as investors fled to the one asset that couldn't be printed. The post-gold world's first act was one of near disintegration. The chaos revealed a profound and unsettling truth. While nations had political sovereignty over their currencies, they did not have economic sovereignty in a globalized world. A country that printed too much money would see its currency plummet, importing inflation through more expensive goods. The market itself became the new, merciless disciplinarian, replacing the automatic mechanism of gold flows with the sudden, brutal punishment of capital flight. The question was no longer how to maintain a gold peg, but how to maintain market confidence, a far more fickle and unforgiving master. The search for a new anchor, for a doctrine to replace the slain golden rule, would define the next brutal chapter. The new high priests. Who holds the power in a world without gold? The answer, forged in the fire of the Great Inflation, was the central bankers. As elected politicians proved unable or unwilling to tame the price spiral, unelected technocrats stepped into the void. Their prophet was Paul Volcker, appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1979. Volcker understood that to slay inflation, he had to slay the expectation of inflation. He declared war, not with price controls, but with brutally high interest rates. The federal funds rate was pushed to an unprecedented 20%. The economy was plunged into a deep, intentional recession. It was a shock therapy of deliberate pain, a demonstration that the new central bank authority could be even more ruthless than the old golden anchor. Volcker's crusade was the defining monetary event of the late 20th century. It worked. Inflation was broken, but the cost was immense. Bankruptcies, sky-high unemployment, and a global debt crisis in the developing world. The victory, however, established a new dogma: the primacy of price stability. Central banks around the world, now increasingly independent from political control, adopted this Volcker doctrine. Their new anchor became not gold, but a low, stable inflation target, usually around 2%. This was the Great Moderation, a period from the mid-1980s to 2007 where inflation was low, recessions were mild, and growth was steady. The new high priests, with their sophisticated models and communication strategies, seemed to have mastered the fiat universe. This era also saw the final, complete demonetization of gold. It was removed from the vaults of symbolism and reclassified as just another commodity, a barbarous relic, in the words of Keynes, albeit a shiny one. Central banks began slowly selling off their gold reserves. The metal's price, while volatile, was now seen as a sentiment indicator, not a monetary cornerstone. The real business of global finance exploded in complexity: derivatives, currency swaps, securitized debt, all built on a foundation of pure trust in central bank management and the stability of fiat currencies. The system appeared elegant, sophisticated, and profoundly stable. It was a stability built on confidence in institutions, not in metal. But this new faith had its own inherent fragility. The power of central banks to create limitless liquidity, the very power that made them effective managers, also created immense moral hazard. Financial institutions grew larger and more leveraged, believing the Greenspan put, the idea that the Fed would always step into lower rates and provide liquidity in a crisis, was a guarantee against catastrophic failure. Risk was underpriced. Debt mountains grew in the shadows. The system had traded the external constraint of gold for an internal constraint of technocratic judgment. The question became, what happens when the judgment of the new high priests fails, or when the limits of their power are tested by a crisis larger than their models? The anchor was now human, and therefore fallible. The shadow of debt. If gold was a physical limit on money creation, what is the limit in a fiat world? The answer, terrifyingly, is that there is no hard limit. Only political and economic consequences that arrive slowly, then all at once. The post-gold era unleashed an age of credit on a scale previously unimaginable. Governments, no longer constrained by the need to back their spending with metal, could run persistent deficits, financing them by issuing bonds that central banks could, in extremis, monetize. The global debt-to-GDP ratio, both public and private, began a long, relentless climb. Debt became the new lubricant of growth and the new source of systemic risk. This debt supercycle was supercharged by financial globalization and innovation. The dismantling of capital controls and the rise of complex securitization allowed savings from one corner of the world to fund consumption and speculation in another. The system became a vast, interconnected web of promises. The 2008 global financial crisis was the direct result of this new paradigm. It was not a crisis caused by a shortage of gold, but by a catastrophic abundance of bad credit. Credit built on inflated asset prices, poor underwriting, and a fatal mispricing of risk. When the housing bubble in the United States burst, the chain reaction threatened to collapse the entire global banking system. The response to the crisis was the ultimate demonstration of the fiat system's powers and perils. Central banks led by the Federal Reserve performed what would have been impossible under a gold standard. They engaged in quantitative easing, creating trillions of dollars, euros, and yen out of thin air to purchase assets and backstop the financial system. They pushed interest rates to zero and then below. They became the lenders of last resort to the entire economy. This unprecedented intervention prevented a second Great Depression, but it also massively expanded central bank balance sheets and inflated asset prices, widening wealth inequality. The medicine saved the patient, but with profound and lingering side effects. The post-2008 world laid bare the new reality. The constraint was no longer a vault of gold, but the credibility of central banks and the stability of the debt markets themselves. The system now operates on a knife's edge. Too much tightening risks triggering a debt deflation spiral. Too much easing risks currency devaluation, asset bubbles, and a loss of faith in money itself. The ghost of gold haunts this landscape in the form of rising concerns about fiscal dominance, where central banks are forced to monetize government debt to keep borrowing costs low, effectively surrendering their inflation-fighting mandate. The execution of gold solved one set of problems, but birthed another, perhaps more complex, set in its place. The rise of digital challengers. Can you kill an idea as powerful as gold? The 21st century has provided a startling answer. Perhaps not, but you can digitize it. In 2009, in the ashes of the financial crisis, an anonymous entity named Satoshi Nakamoto launched Bitcoin. Its foundational document explicitly cited the failure of central banks and the need for a trustless, decentralized form of money with a fixed, algorithmic supply, a deliberate echo of the gold standard scarcity, but rendered in code. Bitcoin and the thousands of cryptocurrencies that followed represent a profound ideological challenge to the fiat system, a rejection of central bank sovereignty and a return to a rules-based, unforgiving monetary policy. This movement, often called digital gold, highlights the enduring appeal of the very principles the gold standard embodied: verifiable scarcity, resistance to censorship, and independence from state control. For its advocates, cryptocurrencies are the logical evolution of sound money. Fixing gold's physical limitations, it's hard to send across the internet. while preserving its core anti-inflationary ethos. They represent a vote of no confidence in the managed money system, a technological solution to the problem of human fallibility and political temptation in monetary affairs. The battle is no longer between metal and paper, but between centralized fiat and decentralized code. Simultaneously, central banks themselves are responding with their own digital revolution. Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. A CBDC is not a cryptocurrency. It is the opposite. It is fiat money made more efficient, more traceable, and more powerful. It represents the ultimate consolidation of state monetary power, allowing for direct transmission of policy, potentially programmable money, and unprecedented oversight of the financial system. The rise of CBDCs promises efficiency and financial inclusion, but also raises specters of privacy erosion and enhanced financial control. It is the apotheosis of the sovereign money model that began when Roosevelt confiscated gold. We now stand at a strange crossroads. One path points toward a decentralized, fragmented future of digital assets competing with state money. The other points toward a more centralized, efficient, and potentially intrusive system of digital fiat. Both are reactions to the perceived failures of the current hybrid system. This brewing contest is the latest chapter in the eternal struggle between the desire for stable, predictable money and the state's need for flexibility and control. The execution of gold did not end this struggle. It merely moved it to a new, digital battlefield. The fundamental questions of what backs money and who controls it remain as urgent as ever. The unresolved paradox. So, was it murder or mercy? The verdict on the gold standard's execution remains fiercely contested, a paradox at the heart of modern economics. Its defenders, the advocates of sound money, argue that its abandonment was the original sin of modern finance. They point to the relentless devaluation of fiat currencies, the explosion of global debt, the endless boom-bust cycles fueled by easy money, and the erosion of savings as evidence. For them, the gold standard was a necessary discipline, a check on the inflationary impulses of states and the moral hazard of bankers. Its removal, they contend, has led to a world of financial fragility and hidden inflation in asset prices, benefiting the wealthy at the expense of the prudent. The prosecutors, however, present a compelling case for justifiable homicide. They argue that the gold standard was a destructive anachronism in a complex, modern world. It forced mass unemployment during downturns, prevented necessary government action during crises, and placed an arbitrary constraint on human development. The ability to use flexible monetary and fiscal policy, they say, saved capitalism from itself during the Great Depression and the 2008 crisis. The post-gold era, for all its volatility, has coincided with unprecedented global growth, a dramatic reduction in extreme poverty, and the financial tools to manage, if not prevent, economic disasters. The trade-off, in this view, was not just necessary, but righteous. The truth likely lies in the uncomfortable center. The gold standard provided long-term price stability, but at the cost of short-term human suffering and economic rigidity. The fiat system provides vital flexibility and tools for crisis management, but at the cost of long-term currency devaluation, debt accumulation, and the constant risk of losing the hard-won credibility of central banks. We exchanged one set of problems for another. The secret murder was not a conspiracy, but a series of pragmatic, desperate choices made by leaders facing impossible trade-offs between international stability and domestic survival, between long-term discipline and short-term catastrophe. This leaves us with the unresolved question: what is the true anchor of our money? Is it the credibility of institutions, the judgment of technocrats, the whims of the market, or the immutable laws of mathematics in a blockchain? The 20th century executed the golden anchor, believing it had found a better way. The 21st century is now testing that belief to its absolute limits. In a world of quantitative easing, global debt mountains, digital challengers, and resurgent inflation, the execution may be a historical fact, but the trial of its consequences is still ongoing, with the stability of our entire global economic order in the balance. The ghost in the machine. The anchor is gone, but we still feel its drag. Gold's execution did not erase its memory from the financial psyche. It remains the ghost in the machine of global finance, a spectral benchmark against which all other forms of money are unconsciously measured. In times of crisis, geopolitical tension, or fears of currency debasement, its price spikes, a silent alarm bell signaling a loss of confidence in the managed system. Central banks, once sellers, have become net buyers again since the 2008 crisis, not to restore a standard, but as a strategic hedge, a tacit admission that the ultimate store of value still holds a unique power. The relic is not so barbarous after all. This enduring allure reveals a deep, unmet need in the human relationship with money, the desire for something external, something beyond the promise of fallible institutions. Gold represented nature's limit. Fiat money represents society's promise. Cryptocurrencies represent technology's algorithm. We are caught between these competing visions of truth. The modern monetary system is a magnificent, terrifying engine of growth and innovation, but it runs on the fuel of trust, a resource that can be depleted by inflation, inequality, and political dysfunction. The ghost of gold is the memory of a time when trust was not placed in humans, but in a metal, for better and for worse. Our world today is the direct product of that fateful series of decisions, from Roosevelt's confiscation to Nixon's shock. The floating exchange rates the dominant power of the US dollar as a fiat reserve currency, the activist role of central banks as market makers of last resort, the globalized capital flows that can build nations or destroy them overnight. All of this is the landscape of the post-execution era. We have gained an astonishing toolkit for managing economies, but we have also assumed a godlike responsibility for maintaining the stability of a system with no automatic, external stabilizer. The weight of that responsibility grows heavier with each crisis. The final, unanswerable question is one of legacy. Did we, in executing the gold standard, liberate ourselves from a primitive constraint to build a more prosperous, responsive, and humane economic world? Or did we sever our last tangible link to reality, unleashing a monster of debt, volatility, and centralized power that will ultimately demand a reckoning more severe than any gold standard recession? The experiment is still running. The markets tick, the central banks deliberate, the algorithms mine, and the ghost of the golden anchor watches from the depths, a silent judge of the system we built in its absence. The execution is complete. The consequences are forever. We sail on a sea of data, guided by the stars of economic indicators and the compass of central bank policy. The anchor is a memory. The stability we seek is now a daily calculation. Was the death of gold a necessary evolution or a catastrophic error in judgment? The debate defines our financial future. This was not just history. This is the operating system of our world. If you want to understand the forces that will shape the next crisis, the next currency, the next revolution in value, you must understand the rules of the game that was built on gold's grave. Subscribe now. Dive deeper. In our next investigation, we trace the invisible thread from the fall of gold to the rise of cryptocurrency empires and the coming battle over central bank digital currencies. The story of money is the story of power, and it's far from over.